In the annals of World War II, amid the chaos and destruction that consumed Europe, there emerged a story that defied all expectations. A story of a single decision that preserved one of humanity's greatest cultural treasures. This is the account of Dietrich von Choltitz, a German general who stood against Adolf Hitler himself to save the City of Light, Paris. The mere mention of its name evokes images of timeless beauty, artistic grandeur, and centuries of human achievement. For over 2,000 years, this city has stood as a beacon of culture, art, and human aspiration. Its boulevards, designed by Baron Haussmann, transformed urban planning forever. Its monuments, the Eiffel Tower, Notre Dame Cathedral, the Arc de Triomphe, the Louvre, represent not merely French achievement, but the pinnacle of Western civilization itself. Yet in August 1944, this magnificent city stood on the precipice of total annihilation. Everything that Paris represented, everything it had contributed to human civilization over 2 millennia, faced destruction at the hands of a regime determined to leave nothing but ashes. The man tasked with its destruction was the same man who would ultimately become its savior. His name was Dietrich von Choltitz, born on the 9th of November, 1894. To understand the magnitude of his decision to spare Paris, we must first understand the man he was, the reputation he had built, and the orders he received. Dietrich von Choltitz was not known for mercy. Throughout the war, he had earned a reputation that preceded him wherever the Wehrmacht marched. His fellow officers and his enemies alike knew him by a chilling moniker, the Destroyer of Cities. This was not a title given lightly, nor was it undeserved. Von Choltitz had built his military career on ruthless efficiency and unwavering obedience to orders. He came from a long line of Prussian military officers, a tradition that valued discipline, duty, and absolute loyalty above all else. In Prussian military culture, questioning orders was not merely discouraged, it was unthinkable. Von Choltitz joined the German army as a young man, serving in World War I, where he learned the harsh realities of modern warfare. The experience shaped him into a professional soldier who understood that war demanded difficult decisions and brutal actions. These were the principles that guided his military career for decades. When World War II erupted in 1939, von Choltitz found himself serving a regime that took these principles to their most extreme conclusion. The Nazi war machine demanded not just military victory, but total domination. And when Nazi forces could not claim a city for the Third Reich, they would ensure that no one else could benefit from it either. The pattern was well established throughout occupied Europe. Whenever the Wehrmacht retreated, destruction followed. The strategy was simple, yet devastating. Leave nothing standing, leave not one stone upon another. Total destruction, complete obliteration. This scorched earth policy became the hallmark of Nazi retreat, and von Choltitz was one of its most effective executors. In Rotterdam, in Sevastopol, in countless Eastern European towns, von Choltitz oversaw destruction on a massive scale. He did not question the morality of these actions. He did not pause to consider the cultural heritage being lost. He was a soldier, following orders, doing his duty to the fatherland. This policy became particularly pronounced during the German retreat from the Eastern Front. The invasion of the Soviet Union had begun with stunning success in June 1941, but by 1943, the tide had turned. The disaster at Stalingrad marked the beginning of a long, brutal retreat westward. As Soviet forces reclaimed territory, von Choltitz demonstrated the full extent of his reputation. Having lost the majority of his forces in brutal engagements against the Red Army, he issued stark orders to his remaining men. Destroy everything that might prove useful to the enemy. Bridges were blown, factories were razed, entire neighborhoods were reduced to smoking ruins. Infrastructure that had taken generations to build was demolished in hours. This was the work of Dietrich von Choltitz, a man who executed his orders with mechanical precision, never questioning, never hesitating. His superiors in Berlin appreciated this quality immensely. Here was a general who could be relied upon to carry out even the most extreme commands without moral reservations or bureaucratic delays. When difficult decisions needed to be made, when cities needed to be sacrificed, von Choltitz was the instrument of choice. This reputation, built on unwavering obedience and ruthless efficiency, would prove to be precisely why Adolf Hitler selected him for what the Führer believed would be von Choltitz's greatest act of destruction: the annihilation of Paris. On the 7th of August 1944, Dietrich von Choltitz received new orders that would alter the course of history. He was appointed military governor of Paris. To most observers, this might have seemed like a prestigious posting, an opportunity to oversee one of Europe's most beautiful and culturally significant cities during the final months of occupation. But von Choltitz knew better. Given his reputation and the deteriorating military situation, this was not a reward or an honor. This was a mission of destruction. The very next day, on August 8th, von Choltitz was summoned to a meeting with the Führer himself at Hitler's headquarters. In that encounter, Adolf Hitler made his intentions absolutely clear. There would be no ambiguity, no room for interpretation, no possibility of misunderstanding. Hitler personally instructed von Choltitz to prepare for the total destruction of Paris. The order was explicit and uncompromising. Not one stone was to remain upon another. The city that had stood for over 2,000 years, that had survived barbarian invasions, medieval plagues, religious wars, and revolutions, was to be wiped from the face of the earth. Why did Hitler want Paris destroyed? The reasons were both strategic and deeply psychological. By August 1944, the strategic situation in France had become untenable for Germany. Following the successful Allied D-Day landings in Normandy on June 6th, American, British, and Canadian forces had broken out of their beachheads and were advancing rapidly across France. The German army in the west was in disarray. Entire divisions had been destroyed in the Falaise pocket. Supply lines were severed. Reinforcements were unavailable. It became increasingly clear that Germany could not hold France, and Paris, the symbolic heart of occupied Europe, would inevitably fall to the Allies. For Hitler, this was psychologically intolerable. Paris represented one of the greatest prizes of the 1940 conquest of France. When German troops had marched down the Champs-Élysées in June 1940, it had been a moment of supreme triumph for the Third Reich. Hitler himself had visited Paris, posing for photographs before the Eiffel Tower, touring monuments like a conquering Caesar. Now, 4 years later, that triumph was turning to ashes. If the Third Reich could not possess Paris, Hitler reasoned, then no one would. The city would serve as a monument to German power through its very destruction. The psychological impact on the Allies, on the French resistance, on the watching world would be devastating. Moreover, Hitler's mental state by this point in the war had deteriorated significantly. His decisions became increasingly erratic, driven more by rage and spite than military logic. He was no longer fighting to win the war. By August 1944, rational observers knew Germany had already lost, but fighting to inflict maximum damage on his enemies before the inevitable end. The destruction of Paris represented the ultimate act of vengeance. Against France for daring to resist, against the Allies for daring to challenge German supremacy, against the world for rejecting his vision of a 1,000-year Reich. If he could not rule over Paris, he would rule over its ruins. Von Choltitz understood his role perfectly. His appointment was not about governance or military administration. His sole purpose, the entire reason for his selection, was to oversee the city's obliteration. His past performance, his established reputation as the destroyer of cities, made him the obvious and perhaps only choice for this catastrophic task. He had done it before in the East, reducing cities to rubble without hesitation. He would do it again in Paris, or so Hitler believed. Von Choltitz arrived in Paris on August 9, 1944, to assume his newly appointed position as military governor. The city he entered was one of extraordinary beauty, despite 4 years of occupation. Its architecture remained largely intact. Its streets still bore the character that had inspired artists, writers, and musicians for generations. The Seine still flowed peacefully through the heart of the city, spanned by elegant bridges that had stood for centuries. But even as he settled into his headquarters at the Hôtel Maurice on the Rue de Rivoli, the orders from Berlin were reinforced. Hitler, ensuring there could be no misunderstanding of his expectations, sent a telegram. The message was terse and brutal. The city must not fall into enemy hands except as a field of ruins. Additional instructions followed in subsequent days. Explosives were to be placed at all strategically important points. The bridges across the Seine were to be wired for demolition. Major monuments and government buildings were to be prepared for destruction. The Eiffel Tower, Notre Dame Cathedral, the Palais Garnier Opera House, the Military Academy, the telephone exchanges, all were to be demolished. The preparations were thorough and systematic. German engineers worked methodically, placing explosives at critical points throughout the city. The infrastructure of destruction was put in place. Everything was ready. All that remained was the final order to execute the plan. The stage was set for the annihilation of one of humanity's greatest cities. The man capable of carrying out such destruction was in place. The orders had been given, confirmed, and reinforced multiple times. The explosives were positioned. Everything pointed toward catastrophe. Yet something remarkable was about to happen. Something that no one, least of all Adolf Hitler, could have predicted or imagined. What transpires in the mind of a man when he confronts a choice between absolute obedience and moral rebellion? For Dietrich von Choltitz, this question became urgently real during those tense weeks in August 1944. As military governor of Paris, von Choltitz possessed the complete means to execute Hitler's orders. The explosives had been positioned at strategic locations throughout the city. The Eiffel Tower, that soaring symbol of French ingenuity, was wired with enough explosives to bring it crashing down. Notre Dame Cathedral, which had witnessed over 600 years of French history, could be reduced to rubble with a single command. The graceful bridges spanning the Seine, architectural masterpieces in their own right, were ready to be blown into the river. A single command from von Choltitz, and Paris would cease to exist as the world knew it. The preparations were complete. The soldiers were in position, awaiting orders. The detonators were ready. The machinery of destruction was fully operational. All that remained was for von Choltitz to give the word. But as the days passed, something unexpected began to happen. Von Choltitz, the hardened military professional, the obedient soldier who had never questioned orders, found himself confronting questions he had never before allowed himself to ask. He walked the streets of Paris, observing the city in a way he had never observed the cities he had previously destroyed. Perhaps because those cities had been in the chaos of active combat, or perhaps because he had never allowed himself to truly see them. Von Choltitz began to experience Paris not as a military objective, but as a living testament to human achievement. The architecture spoke to him in ways he had not anticipated. The elegant proportions of the buildings, the harmonious design of the boulevards, the way the city seemed to flow organically despite centuries of careful planning. All of this began to affect him profoundly. He visited Notre Dame and stood beneath its soaring Gothic arches, contemplating the generations of craftsmen who had labored to create such beauty. He walked along the Seine at sunset, watching the light play on the water and the buildings. He observed ordinary Parisians going about their lives under occupation, maintaining their dignity despite years of hardship. For the first time in his military career, Dietrich von Choltitz found himself unable to view his objective with professional detachment. He could not reduce Paris to mere strategic coordinates on a map. The city had become real to him in a way that previous targets had not. Meanwhile, the military situation continued to deteriorate. Allied forces were approaching rapidly. Within the city, the French resistance had begun to stir, preparing for an uprising. Von Choltitz received increasingly frantic messages from Berlin, demanding updates on the demolition preparations and insisting that the orders be executed. But von Choltitz stalled. He cited technical difficulties, logistical problems, the need for more explosives. He delayed and prevaricated, buying time while he wrestled with his conscience. He also began to reach certain military and political conclusions that made the destruction of Paris seem not just morally wrong, but strategically pointless. By late August 1944, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. Germany had already lost. The only question was how long the fighting would continue and how much more destruction would occur before the final surrender. The D-Day invasion had succeeded beyond the Allies' most optimistic projections. Soviet forces were sweeping across Eastern Europe, advancing toward Germany itself. Italy had already fallen. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. The supposedly impregnable fortress Europe had crumbled. Destroying Paris would achieve nothing of genuine military value. It would not slow the Allied advance by more than a few days at most. It would not change the war's outcome in any meaningful way. It would serve only as a final, futile gesture of destruction, the act of a madman refusing to accept inevitable defeat. Von Choltitz recognized this reality with increasing clarity. He understood that he was being ordered to commit an act of cultural genocide for no strategic purpose whatsoever, solely to satisfy the vengeful rage of a leader who had lost all connection to reason and reality. The question he faced was profound. Did he owe greater loyalty to his oath of obedience or to some higher principle that transcended military discipline? Was he merely an instrument to be used for whatever purpose his superiors commanded, or did he possess moral agency and individual responsibility? These were not questions that Prussian military tradition encouraged, but circumstances had forced them upon von Choltitz, and he could no longer avoid answering them. As Allied forces approached Paris and the French resistance rose up within the city, the moment of decision arrived. On August 25th, 1944, Dietrich von Choltitz faced his moment of truth. The explosives remained in place. His men awaited orders. Berlin was demanding action. Hitler expected nothing less than total destruction. The weight of military tradition, of personal oath, of career-long habits of obedience, all pressed von Choltitz toward compliance. But he chose differently. Instead of reducing Paris to rubble, instead of executing the orders he had been specifically appointed to carry out, Dietrich von Choltitz did something unprecedented in his military career. He surrendered the city to the Free French forces, intact and undamaged. This was not a gradual change of heart spread over weeks or months. This was a definitive act of defiance against direct, repeatedly confirmed orders from Adolf Hitler himself. For a man who had built his entire reputation on unwavering obedience, who had never before questioned a command, this represented a complete transformation. The uniqueness of this decision cannot be overstated. Throughout World War II and in the decades of trials and historical examination that followed, countless German officers and soldiers claimed they were simply following orders, that they bore no personal responsibility for the atrocities committed in the name of the Third Reich. The phrase, "I was only following orders," became synonymous with moral cowardice and the abdication of personal responsibility. Yet here was an officer who refused to follow orders, who chose personal moral judgment over military discipline, who decided that some orders were so wrong, so contrary to basic human values, that they must be disobeyed regardless of consequences. The surrender itself was formalized at multiple locations. First at the Prefecture of Police, where French resistance fighters and arriving Free French forces accepted the capitulation of German troops. Then at von Choltitz's headquarters at the Hotel Meurice, where the formal transfer of authority took place. When French officers arrived to accept the surrender, they found the general prepared to transfer authority peacefully and completely. There were no last-minute demolitions, no desperate acts of destruction, no final defiant gestures. The bridges stood intact. The monuments remained unharmed. Notre Dame's bells, silent for 4 years of occupation, would soon ring again to celebrate liberation. This restraint was particularly remarkable given the circumstances and the pressure von Choltitz faced. He was not simply choosing to spare Paris, he was actively defying repeated direct orders from the supreme commander of the German armed forces. Orders that had been personally delivered and subsequently reinforced multiple times. In what has become one of the most famous moments of this entire episode, Hitler reportedly telephoned von Choltitz at his headquarters on that very day, August 25th. According to accounts from those who were present, the Führer's rage was barely contained as he demanded to know, "Is Paris burning?" One can imagine that telephone call. The master of the Third Reich, watching his empire crumble around him, demanding confirmation that at least this final act of destruction had been carried out. And von Choltitz, the loyal soldier, the obedient general, the man chosen specifically for his willingness to destroy without question, delivering the truth that Hitler could not accept. No, Paris was not burning. Paris would not burn. The order had been disobeyed. Hitler's fury was absolute, but it was also impotent. Thousands of miles away in his bunker in East Prussia, he could rage and threaten, but he could not change what von Choltitz had done. The decision had been made. The orders had been disobeyed. The city had been saved. The surrender of Paris to Free French forces proceeded smoothly and without incident. German troops laid down their arms in an orderly fashion. The occupation ended not with apocalyptic destruction, but with a remarkably peaceful transfer of power. Within hours, General Charles de Gaulle would walk the liberated streets of Paris in triumph, and the tricolor flag of France would fly once more over the city's buildings. For his actions, or more precisely, for his refusal to act in destroying Paris, Dietrich von Choltitz earned a new title, one far more honorable than Destroyer of Cities. He became known forever after as the Savior of Paris. This designation was not merely symbolic or honorific. Von Choltitz's decision preserved irreplaceable cultural heritage that can never be reconstructed once destroyed. He saved countless lives that would have been lost in the destruction and the inevitable battle for the ruins. He prevented an act of cultural vandalism that would have scarred humanity's collective memory for all time. The preservation of Paris did not exempt Dietrich von Choltitz from the consequences faced by all defeated German military leaders. He was taken prisoner by Allied forces and would spend the next several years in captivity, facing an uncertain future. His first place of detention was Trent Park in London, a facility specifically designated for senior German officers. This was no ordinary prison camp. Trent Park served as an elaborate intelligence-gathering operation, where captured German generals were housed in relative comfort while their conversations were secretly recorded by British intelligence services. From Trent Park, von Choltitz was transferred across the Atlantic to Camp Clinton in Mississippi, United States, where he remained until his release in 1947. His treatment as a prisoner of war was generally correct and in accordance with international conventions, befitting his rank and perhaps some recognition of his actions in Paris. After his release, von Choltitz returned to a Germany that bore little resemblance to the nation he had served. The country lay divided between the victorious powers, its cities in ruins, its people grappling with the enormity of the crimes committed in their name. For former Wehrmacht officers, these were difficult years of reckoning and adjustment. Von Choltitz settled in Baden-Baden and lived quietly, largely avoiding public attention. In 1951, he published his memoirs, titled Brennt Paris. Is Paris burning? Taking the question Hitler had asked him and turning it into a testament to his decision. The book provided his account of those crucial days in August 1944 and offered his perspective on why he chose to disobey orders. The memoirs were inevitably controversial. Some hailed von Choltitz as a hero who found his conscience at the critical moment, a man who proved that individual moral choice remains possible even within totalitarian systems. Others questioned whether he deserved special credit for simply not committing one final atrocity, especially given his willingness to destroy other cities earlier in the war. This debate touches on profound questions about moral responsibility, redemption, and the nature of heroism. Can a single good act counterbalance previous destructive ones? Does the preservation of Paris absolve von Choltitz of his role in other demolitions throughout the Eastern Front? Is he a hero or merely someone who finally refused to commit one more crime? These questions have no simple answers, and historians continue to grapple with von Choltitz's complex legacy. Some argue that he should be judged primarily on his refusal to destroy Paris, while others insist that his entire wartime record must be considered. The truth, as is often the case with historical figures, likely lies somewhere between these extremes. What remains undisputed, however, is the objective result of his decision. Paris stands today essentially as it stood in August 1944. The Eiffel Tower still rises above the Seine, its iron lattice work unchanged. Notre Dame Cathedral, despite suffering a tragic fire in 2019, survived the war intact and has been carefully restored. The Louvre still houses humanity's artistic treasures. The bridges, the boulevards, the Arc de Triomphe, all remain. Millions of people visit Paris each year, walking streets that would have been rubble, admiring monuments that would have been destroyed, experiencing a city that, by all logic and expectation, given Hitler's orders, should not exist in its current form. Every one of these visitors, whether they know it or not, owes a debt to a German general who, at the crucial moment, said no. Dietrich von Choltitz died in November 1966 at the Baden Municipal Hospital. He was 72 years old. In France, his death was noted with a respect rarely afforded to former enemy commanders. The city he saved remembered him with gratitude, even as the complexities of his full wartime record remained subject to ongoing historical scrutiny and debate. The story of Dietrich von Choltitz and the salvation of Paris reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual choices matter profoundly. One man, faced with orders to commit an unthinkable act of cultural destruction, chose differently. Was it love of beauty that stayed his hand? Recognition that he was serving a madman's orders? A soldier's final assertion of moral authority over blind obedience? Perhaps it was all of these factors, intertwined in ways von Choltitz himself could never fully articulate. What we know with certainty is this: Paris stands. The city of light endured its darkest hour and emerged intact, preserved by a decision that defied expectation, defied orders, and perhaps, in some measure, redeemed one man's troubled legacy. In the end, that single decision transformed Dietrich von Choltitz from the destroyer of cities into the savior of Paris. And in doing so, it preserved for all future generations a city that represents the highest aspirations of human civilization. This has been the story of how Paris was saved.